This talk is part of a lecture series by Lou R. Hughes, who's been one of our sponsors here. And so we're pleased to be able to offer what is obviously a topic of enormous interest here in Washington and everywhere else as we look at the threats that are posed by terrorist groups and the importance of financing as a resource for them. We're very pleased today that we've been able to secure Amit Kumar, who is someone I met a few years ago and have been watching the fact that he's very much in demand on this very subject. Although he has focused on South Asia, we found out is also well informed about the Middle East in general as far as financing. And so we've asked him to sort of compare the two and the circumstances around financing in both. And just to remind you, though, that the Middle East Institute has, from its founding, decided, at least a year after, because it was founded in '46 and Pakistan didn't come into existence until next year, but it has from the outset thought of Afghanistan and Pakistan as part of the Middle East, the greater Middle East. Well, now let me just have this opportunity to welcome Amit Kumar. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Marvin and Kate for inviting me, and I've literally grown up watching Marvin's marvelous work on both South Asia and Middle East, and it's such a long body of work, and that sort of gives you some idea of how old I am. This is really a privilege. So what I'm going to do is quickly run through some important parameters of a comparative assessment of the South Asian terrorist financing networks versus Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks. One is the motivation of the donors. Initially, and I would like to mention three events in 1979 which really set the tone for the study, as well as the actual practice of statecraft. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The Iranian Revolution took place, and there was a storming of the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia. So these are three, I would say, cataclysmic events from the standpoint of the birth of radical terrorism and its financing and so on and so forth. In terms of motivations of donors, as far as South Asia is concerned, they were anti-Soviet to begin with. In the first Afghanistan war, then in the second one, it's anti-US-led NATO coalition. And now the danger is with the announcement of the Al-Qaeda in South Asia regional would-be caliphate, as it were, by Ayman al-Zawahiri about a month back, there is an anti-India focus. That's what the fear of people in the region is. As far as the Middle East is concerned, there was the anti-US focus in the Gulf War, and now it's an anti-Assad and anti-Shia focus. It suffices to say that both as far as South Asian terrorist financing networks go and the Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks go, countries who are the donor countries, as it were, or the individuals, I'm not saying countries per se have a state policy of donating to a certain cause. They may or may not. But the individuals, especially the rich donors, do, in big numbers sometimes. They do try to cater to the domestic constituencies, in the South Asian case in Pakistan, some of the more radical elements, probably some elements of the army, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the donors do want to cater to their domestic constituencies and appease them so that they don't cause damage within their countries. In the same way, as far as the Middle Eastern countries are concerned, the domestic constituencies, especially the radical ones, have to be catered to. And the Gulf donors, for example, are really mindful of that. And they want to make sure that these forces are appeased. And then they're also mindful of the fact, or may not be mindful of the fact, that these forces may like to perpetrate terrorist acts outside their state, their home states. And that's why you have the Sunni radical forces being diverted to Syria, or the Sunni radical forces in the Gulf donating to causes in South Asia, either against the US or against Afghanistan or against India, as the case may be. The profile of donors is the second thing that's important. Generally rich donors and unwitting smaller donors. When I say unwitting smaller donors, I'm looking essentially at unwitting donors in mosques, where you have collection boxes, really. Then the same thing would be true of Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks also, as it is of South Asian terrorist financing networks. Many people question the fact whether the states are directly involved. Are there state sponsors or not? They may be directly involved, or they may turn a blind eye to certain individuals under their nose donating to causes like these, whether it's the anti-Indian cause or the anti-US-led coalition cause in South Asia, or it's the Shia cause, really, or even the South Asian cause in the Middle East. The motivations of terrorist groups are a third important factor. They could be anti-Soviet, like the Mujahideen in the 1980s in Afghanistan. They could be the anti-US-led coalition, as in the second Afghanistan experience that the US has, we've been involved in over the last 12 years. And then there could be anti-India, as some of the groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan and India are concerned, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, for example. Now, many people talk about Lashkar-e-Taiba as a Pakistani group. My sense is it's a South Asian group with reach in India, across South Asia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. And it's got its funding, a lot of it comes from the Gulf as well. So that's I think, an important connection as far as the sources of funding are concerned and the motivations. Similarly, in the Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks, there could be anti-Soviet, where the Gulf donors were donating to the cause of making the Soviets leave Afghanistan, or making the Americans leave Afghanistan in the second stint, actually, last 12 years. Now there may be different motivations also. For example, ISIS's main motivation, beyond really the anti-Sunni motivation, the anti-Shia motivation and the anti-Assad motivation it has, is the really hunger for more territory and governing more territory across Syria and Iraq. Now, some would say that their motivations have been diluted as far as taking out Assad is concerned. It also suffices to say that it looks more like they're content pretty much with trying to consolidate their hold over territories, really, and in exciting donors and others, foot soldiers outside Iran and Iraq, to really contribute their money, their resources. The fallacy generally when you talk about terrorist financing is it's only money that they're donating. It could be hands that they're donating. It could be kind. It could be material support. I mean, the US Treasury's notion of material support is pretty extensive. It covers everything under the sun, from ideological support to motivation to training to messages to even legal assistance. So looking at terrorist financing as beyond money and looking at all kinds of economic resources and financial means. Anything that money can buy, anything that has value. So it has to be looked at that context. What are the methods for raising and moving money in South Asia? Firstly, cash couriers, where people carry money on their bodies, really huge amounts sometimes, or they carry money in their vehicles, cars, and so on and so forth. Could be charities. That's a very big source of the way money is raised and moved in South Asia. Could be illicit business fronts, where you have fake companies, artificial fronts for charities or for illicit businesses. There is this question of hawala, where obviously hawala is used as a licit means of transferring funds by a lot of migrant workers in the Gulf. When they remit funds to South Asia, it's used by them. So to condemn hawala and to guillotine hawaladars as evil, all of them, that's not really very sound. because a lot of them are doing licit business activity. But obviously, like anything else, anything licit gets contaminated by tainted money belonging to terrorists or criminals or money launderers. There is this aspect of trade-based money laundering where trade is used to launder funds. And that takes place a lot between the Middle East and South Asia, the Gulf and South Asia, Dubai and South Asia, for example. So that's an important element, really. There is money laundering by an organization called the D Company, which is basically headed by Dawood Ibrahim. It started off as a criminal syndicate, but is really involved big time in actual terrorist activity. And they're hand in glove with terrorists big time. And they are spreading their tentacles across the Middle East and now Africa as well, in terms of the relationship they have with Boko Haram. Because Boko Haram and the D Company headed by Dawood Ibrahim last year signed an agreement where Boko Haram will be participating in drug trafficking in India, for example. The D Company will be helping them do that. So you have all these kind of networks, and there's not one terrorist network, it could be multiple terrorist networks. There could be a terrorist network as a criminal network also. The same organization may double up as both, you may have separate. For example, in the case of Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Afghan Taliban, a lot of their funds are laundered by Dawood Ibrahim. And Dawood Ibrahim is in cahoots with a lot of the radical forces, either in Afghanistan or Pakistan or even in India sometimes. So that, I think, is an important thing. In terms of Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks, could be cash couriers, could be laundering funds in the Middle East, as I said. Dawood Ibrahim launders his funds through Dubai and through the Bahamas eventually, where recently one of the banks in the Bahamas, one of the bank branches was discovered to contain a few $100,000 belonging to Dawood Ibrahim. So he's parking his money everywhere. And he also apparently siphons off a lot of his money into the Karachi Stock Exchange and other stock exchanges also, because one of the things that the criminals do best is launder money, which is basically disguising the source of their money from their destination. There was this case of the HSBC, the subcommittee on investigations headed by Senator Levin 2 years ago came with some interesting insights of what kind of exposure HSBC has. In the case of Bangladesh, South Asia, they discovered its corresponding banking relationships with Islami Bank, who apparently has got connections or got customers or accounts belonging to Al-Qaeda, listed individuals or otherwise. In the case of HSBC's correspondent relationship in Saudi Arabia with the Al-Raji Bank. The Al-Raji is one of the members of bin Laden's golden chain of 20 biggest funders. Many listed individuals have connections to both South Asia and the Middle East. If you look at the US Treasury in their listings over the last couple of years, a lot of the individuals, about a dozen I can count on my fingertips, who've had relationships or operations both in South Asia as well as the Middle East. And they're listed as belonging to the Islamic State or Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda, for example. Terms of transit points, Iran, interestingly, is used as a transit point for fighters and money from South Asia and the Middle East, as is Dubai, because Dubai is kind of got relatively lax money laundering controls, and it serves as a transshipment point for money and for all other kinds of funds and individuals. Transshipment point between not only the South Asia and Middle East, but outside these two regions as well. What is the direction of funds and fighters' flow? So when I talked about material support, I was talking of funds as well as fighters, or sometimes funds pocketed by fighters, cash couriers, for example. The trend has been from the Gulf states to South Asia, because if you look at the first Afghanistan war of the 1980s, a lot of the Mujahideen comprised of what we call the Afghan Arabs. A lot of folks from the Arab countries came and fought in the Mujahideen. Similarly, in the second front, I mean, obviously, it's after the 1990s and the early 2000s, it's extended more to the Chechens and the others, the Uzbeks and the Central Asians also, but definitely there is a lot of people from North Africa and the Gulf states as well. From Gulf states, Central Asia, to North America, South Asia, and Iraq and Syria. Now what we're seeing is, talking about the foreign fighters, in the case of ISIS, a lot of the foreign fighters are from Tunisia or from Saudi Arabia, a few from Pakistan, and fewer still from India. So you see a constellation of fighters wherever there is the scene of action, you know. And that's been the underlying theme that I'm trying to mention is that there is a lot of crisscross of funds and fighters and ideologies between South Asia and Gulf states, or the Middle East, as it were. I'm always puzzled by the fact that why does the U.S. Central Command end at Pakistan, and why doesn't it continue into India and thereabouts? Given the interaction there, because the U.S. Pacific Command is in charge of India and countries to the east of that. The facilitation of terrorist financing networks in South Asia, for example, there are pre-established channels of financial support which were really established in the 1980s, and they've been pretty handy. If you defeat a terrorist enemy, it doesn't mean you defeat their terrorist financing networks. There is a kind of resilience in the terrorist financing networks. If you kill terrorists, it doesn't mean you've destroyed their financial flows. The financial flows, the donors, the carriers, and the destinations of financial support do continue. There has been the illegal sale of opium, really, from Afghanistan in the early 2000s that has financed a lot of this terrorist activity against the US-led coalition. The role of the D Company in drug trafficking is important. I mentioned that earlier. There is a coercion of the local populations and governance structures. That's what the Taliban did in the 1990s and the early 2000s, even till now. All groups in the terrorist financing network live in comparative harmony. The Afghan Taliban, the other South Asian groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, they are all Al-Qaeda affiliates working in tandem, really. They aren't facing the kind of tensions that the Nusra Front has faced with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, or the Free Syrian Army has faced with both the Al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There are porous borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between India and its neighbors, Afghanistan and Iran, and they're poorly policed, actually. So this facilitates the flow of funds as well as fighters and arms and so on and so forth. And given the age of the internet, the flow of information is really free-flowing. And that's been a big development in the early 2000s, really, compared to the earlier ages. There are a lot of South Asian expatriates in the Gulf countries who can be, most of them licit, but can be exploited, are being exploited by terrorists to fund, to really use for funding purposes for their own ends. Again, given the pre-established channels in the Middle East of financial support from previous wars, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the precursor organization of the Islamic State, had established through Syria a lot of terrorist financing facilitation networks, both of fighters as well as funds. And those hadn't been damaged at all. And they have been used afresh by Al-Qaeda in Iraq's new Avatar, the Islamic State, and by the Al-Nusra Front. One important source is the illegal sale of oil from Iraq and Syria, essentially going to Turkey, to Iran, and Jordan, but mostly to Turkey. So that's another porous border, the Syrian-Turkish border, or the Iranian, or the Iraq-Turkish border, really. There is the role of oil brokers and smugglers in this oil smuggling across the border to Turkey from Syria and Iraq. There is the ingratiation of locals in Iraq by ISIS. The so-called Sunni awakening councils are no longer that awakened. They are collaborating, as it were, with the ISIS guys. So you don't see the kind of Sunni opposition in Anbar that you did 10 years ago. Or that's 7 years ago when General Petraeus really brought forth the Sunni awakening in a big way. After a war of attrition and infighting between ISIS and the al-Nusra Front, ISIS is the predominant group right now, and it's incorporating and co-opting a lot of the Free Syrian Army foot soldiers as well as the al-Nusra Front. The ISIS, Boko Haram material support, ideological support, and information technology support is a striking phenomena. Abu Bakr Shekau, the Boko Haram Nigerian honcho, as it were, is so impressed by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi from ISIS that they've kind of collaborated beyond inspiration into, and as I said earlier, Boko Haram is also collaborating with the D Company, which is again a South Asian criminal come terrorist network with tentacles in the Middle East as well. The efficacy of terrorist financing networks, that's kind of important. In terms of the achievement of objectives of donors and recipients, the Soviet forces left, so the terrorist financing networks were effective in the first Afghan war, then the US-led coalition is leaving. So I would say the terrorist financing networks are pretty effective in their objectives. The same was the earlier Iraq war when we had to leave. So I think the terrorist financing networks, who are still resilient, are pretty much successful, much to our chagrin and to the chagrin of the free world, and for those of us who hate terrorism in any form. One more measure of efficacy is that both in South Asia and the Middle East, because of their diversification of resources and the resilience, funding networks are flush with funds. And thirdly, the terrorist financing networks are resilient to withstand any counterterrorism or countering financing of terrorism strategy. From listed charities in South Asia, there is a use of using trusts in mosques and of cash couriers exploiting the porous borders by the South Asian groups. Also, there are reports that the Afghan Taliban use fake identities to own and operate bank accounts of charities in Pakistan. And the fleeing Taliban operatives like Mullah Omar and others of his ilk withdrew cash and carried it to Pakistan and to the Taliban embassies in the Gulf. And if you remember, only 3 countries recognized the Taliban in the first go in 1996, Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. The terrorist financing networks are also resilient to withstand the countering the financing of terrorism measures in the Middle East with cash couriers and cash transactions and barter and oil smuggling and laundering mechanisms to move the proceeds of the sale of smuggled oil. Now, there is apparently, from some reports, laundering taking place to canalize or to channelize funds from the Gulf donors through banks in London and Europe to Turkish banks, and then Turkish merchants handing over the funds to the forces in Iraq, the ISIS guys and the al-Nusra guys. So the resilience of these terrorist financing networks is really remarkable. CFT measures, sanctions have been very useful in terms of name and shame deterrence element, in terms of actually stymieing the flow of terrorist funds, not very successful. Same way in the Middle East, given the fact that the Middle East, like South Asia, uses a lot of non-banking channels, it's difficult to enforce sanctions measures beyond the proverbial name and shame. Outreach measures by the USG, especially the US Treasury, have been remarkable, both in South Asia as well as especially the Gulf countries, where they really tried hard to bring to the attention of governments, all the Gulf states in Middle East and Turkey, that there is a need, there's a pressing need to curb the flow of terrorist funds by better regulations, by better monitoring of charities, by really monitoring individuals so that they don't export funds and fighters outside, including to South Asia. There are regulatory lacunae in terms of lack of adequate terrorist financing laws and regulations and sanctions measures against wrongdoing. both in South Asia and the Middle East, but hopefully things are improving in at least South Asia and the Middle East. A number of jurisdictions like the Qataris and the Kuwaitis have come out with money laundering laws, but the execution is really something that remains to be seen right now. They're very fledgling, really speaking. The investigatory capacity is pretty weak both in South Asia and in the Middle East, so that's a thing of concern to the US government. What are the takeaways for policy? The South Asian terrorist financing networks rely on funding from the Gulf amongst local sources also. Porous borders result in flow of funds and fighters. The criminal groups aid and abet terrorist financing. The Al-Qaeda's call for a South Asian branch is to ensure that the Gulf donors do not lose interest in South Asia as a result of the exit of US-led coalition forces. So the use of the Al-Qaeda moniker by al-Zawahiri in South Asia is really meant to alert the donors in the Gulf, really, that, please support us. We aren't going away. We'll keep the fight on now against India and in Pakistan, Afghanistan. So please don't leave us. The Middle Eastern terrorist financing networks rely on funding from the Gulf and Turkey. As I mentioned, Turkey really, the criminal elements in Turkey and the money launderers facilitate the import of funds into Iraq and Syria from Turkey. Same way, you have porous borders. ISIS right now, because of success, is attracting most of the funds from the Gulf, because obviously donors are looking for payoffs and returns on their investment. Any organization that has territory is really radical with the most heinous tactics like ISIS is really patronized, again, by individual donors. I wouldn't say that states are involved. I would say that they probably may not be doing enough to really stop these guys, because when the guys go really crazy and mad, it's very difficult to stop these guys. What should be the best CFT measures? Curtailing terrorist financing from the Gulf through sanctions, especially their implementation across South Asia and Gulf states. Stricter border control measures, as I mentioned, porous borders. More aggressive outreach with South Asian states, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. There's the corruption element in Afghanistan also, which has to be taken care of. There's a clampdown on the operatives of the D Company, including through law enforcement, mutual legal assistance, and extradition. The banks in South Asia need to implement more stringent anti-money laundering, countering financial terrorism measures. US security interests need to be squared with US diplomatic interests. There's a tension both in South Asia and the Middle East. For example, we have bases in Qatar and Kuwait, for example. So we got to be careful not to antagonize the Qataris and Kuwaitis, but we need to be alerting them to the fact that a number of Qataris and Kuwaitis have been listed as funding terrorism. The cooperation with India is very important. Greater controls on online recruitment and fundraising need to be undertaken both in South Asia as well as in the Middle East. I believe in the First Amendment, really, but given the heinous nature of YouTube videos, the fact that they're radicalizing many folks, including a lot of the potential and real ISIS recruits, greater outreach to the worship places and exhorting the religious minorities, even here as well as in South Asia and Middle East, to really condemn the harsh tactics of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the al-Nusra guys. Lastly, given the time constraint, I'll just mention very quickly what are the counterterrorism measures as far as the Middle East is concerned. Curtailing terrorist financing from the Gulf through better sanctions measures, stricter border control measures, the continuation of aggressive outreach, which the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. State Department are doing with the Gulf states and Turkey, clamp down on smugglers and oil dealers engaged in black marketing, the export of oil that I mentioned, through seizures, arrests, and designations of these middlemen, as it were. Banks in the Gulf and Turkey need to implement more stringent AML CFT measures. U.S. security interests, as I mentioned earlier, need to be squared with the diplomatic interests. Because if we have diplomatic interests, we should be able to use more diplomatic leverage to suit our ends. A thorough vetting of the free Syrian recruits, including the 5,000 sanctioned by Congress, needs to be done because a lot of them may be co-opted or attracted to ISIS and the al-Nusra. greater controls on online recruitment mentioned, and greater outreach again to the worship places. Many people, I'll just end with this, many people believe that the Al-Qaeda and the Al-Nusra and the ISIS are three separate organizations. My sense is they're all Al-Qaeda offshoots. ISIS created the Al-Nusra Front in the first place, then they fell apart. There was some brotherly squabbling between them, and now they're one and the same. And the Free Syrian Army has been recruiting, has been sort of recruited or co-opted by ISIS essentially. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS may have a geographical division of labor, maybe some difference in tactics, but as far as the Al-Qaeda movement is concerned, they are both in consonance with that. And it appears that they're two separate entities. My sense of the terrorist groups is that they are one and the same, though different forms, as it were, difference in tactics and so on and so forth. Thanks a lot.
If I can just begin with one question before we open it up. In Pakistan, the terrorist groups have been known to have control of legitimate businesses where they don't have to raise funds, they generate their own funds. How common a phenomenon is that?
Well, somewhat common, but I think the problem is it's like saying good Taliban and bad Taliban. It's difficult to distinguish between good funds and bad funds, especially when they're mixed together. So I think they may give the appearance of having illicit businesses, but the funds may be mixed or laundered to the extent that it's really difficult to distinguish what are licit funds and what are illicit funds.
But it is a source.
It is a source, yes. Like Bin Laden's honey business, for example, in Yemen. That was a illicit source. I mean, yeah, it is a source.
Please. Well, please identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Mike Flanagan, I'm a former member from the Hill, and I have a question that's the next question after your speech today, so you could probably give 2 hours on this alone, but I'm going to ask you to tell me about how much money are we talking about that's moving into these organizations as opposed to even 10 years ago, and what is a sample budget? What do they do with this money when they've got it?
Good question, both of them. Right on. It shows your typical oversight prowess from the Hill. I would say it could range anywhere from the hundreds of millions of dollars to even billions. For example, the D Company's enterprise is pegged at $6 billion. The ISIS, by many reports, is around $2 billion. But it's difficult to really put down hard figures, but that's the thing. What do they do with it? They use it for radicalization, recruitment. A lot of them, including ISIS, have well-developed IT websites, Facebook, social media, training, expanding territory, governing territory in the case of ISIS. And I would also say, going back to the Taliban of the 1990s and the early 2000s, Taliban was really the first terrorist group that occupied territory. So when people spring up all of a sudden say ISIS is the first, I think the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, i.e. the Taliban, was the first. They were really ruling with similar heinous methods, but the social acceptability amongst the population was not there. Thank you.
This gentleman down front.
Vijay Kumar, I'm in manufacturing, but I have an abiding.
Just wait for the microphone.
Vijay Kumar, I'm in manufacturing, but I have an abiding interest in the region. Can you say a few words about the state support of terrorism? Because Hafiz Saeed operates openly in Pakistan, as does Dawood Ibrahim.
Yeah.
So could you say a few words about that?
I would say that the Hafiz Saeed operates overtly, very proudly, stomping his foot, as it were, really part of the Pakistani establishment, which he may not really be or even may be. But in the case of Dawood Ibrahim, he's a fugitive from justice. He oscillates, talking about his Gulf connections. He oscillates between Karachi and Dubai with hideouts in both places. And he's been escaping the dragnet of the law enforcement forces in a number of countries. And the US has sanctioned him too. So there is a degree of political support. There may be a degree of financial support. There is actually. Do all elements in Pakistan support him? I don't think so. Some of the radical elements, they do. As far as the relationship between Dawood Ibrahim of the D Company and the state is concerned, ostensibly there is a monetary relationship also with some of the funds coming out of the business getting diverted to some military channels also, especially drug trafficking, which is a big expanding industry. Thanks.
We have a question from the overflow room from Peter Humbre. How much of this money is moving through untraceable hawala instead of bank fronts?
Difficult again to do a financial intelligence analysis because, as I said earlier in response to Marvin's question, very often the licit funds are moved with the illicit funds. And more than hawala, really, cash couriers or cash, bulk cash has really substituted hawala for the better part as far as funds are concerned. So it'd be difficult to see. Banking channels, again, difficult to see because it's laundered based on some investigations, including the HSBC investigation. Generally, what comes out in banks is far lesser than what's flowing through cash couriers or through in the form of drugs or even by hawala, So it's difficult to put numbers, but I would say cash couriers would be big, drugs would be the second one. Bank accounts, if they are discovered, then yes, but the fact is most banks, especially those in South Asia, do not have the kind of leads or the kind of investigatory capacities or even the kind of feedback from governments, including our own. It takes Senator Levin's subcommittee to really unearth the HSBC witting or unwitting connivance with these banks in South Asia and the Middle East, respectively, the ones that I mentioned. Thanks.
Hi, Tony Placido with HSBC's Financial Crimes Compliance Organization. The open source reporting suggests that ISIL or ISIS, depending on how you want to characterize them, are earning as much as $7 million a day in oil revenue. That suggests a volume of funding that really couldn't be accommodated in cash transactions or the like. Is there any information out there about how they're moving that amount of money on a regular basis and where it hits the financial sector, the formal financial sector? Because it would seem that it would have to if they're accumulating that amount of money.
It would have to, unless the transactions are done via barter, which they are in some cases. By barter, you are smuggling in arms and you're getting funds and smuggling arms, or something like that. But you're right, most of it is cash. It has to be washed in some banking channel. So far, that's, I think, a job that's cut out for the USG and Turkey especially, because among the jurisdictions, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, Turkey is really the jurisdiction which is the preferred jurisdiction of choice. Eventually, because a lot of this oil is resold also. If one broker buys it, he sells it to a third, and so on and so forth. And given the fact that it's sold for as low as $15 a barrel, given the $100 a barrel international rate, there are a lot of middlemen making money. So yes, it has to be washed in banking channels, and investigations probably would be done and could be done in that. But given the problems we're facing with Turkey diplomatically and its support of ISIS, again, the domestic considerations. The PKK is something that the Turks are very wary about. They're wary about people in Kobani, the Syrian Kurds. They're wary about the Iraqi Kurds, and they're wary about the Iranian Kurds. So you have political considerations coming in the way of law enforcement or investigatory collaboration between the US and Turkey, for example. Thanks.
This gentleman.
Hi, Dan Campos, Department of Treasury. Just had a question. You mentioned earlier Iran and UAE as facilitators of terrorism finances, or the flows going through those countries. Do you see any divides on a sectarian level between these financial institutions?
Well, you talk about sectarian levels, you talk about Shia Sunni?
Sunni banks versus Shia banks.
Not really, because The behavior of the Iranians is very complicated also, because on one hand, they don't like Al-Qaeda, it's the Sunni radical element. On the other hand, they let it pass, given the important condition that none of their nationals should be joining them. That's one condition. And then second is they would not be perpetrating any terrorism within Iran. So I don't think there is a Sunni Shia, because when it comes to money, there is no Sunni, no Shia. When it comes to terrorism, there's no good Taliban, there's no bad Taliban. Terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. Even General Petraeus was very categorical in mentioning there's no Pak Taliban, there's no Afghan Taliban. The Taliban is the Taliban is the Taliban, you know.
I am retired Colonel Sajjad from Bangladesh, sir. For last 7 years, I am teaching in the Islamic schools and in the madrasas. The problem is too big. One example I'd like to give you is that every Muslim gives 2.5% of his annual income for the zakat. Hadiah, you can give any amount you like. And every Islamic bank has 10% CSR, corporate social responsibility. Now, how do you monitor them? That's number one. Number two, whenever we talk about Middle Eastern policies and every problem in Afghanistan, South Asia, everything, we talk about order and interest. But we don't talk about harmony and healing. Motivation. People to be motivated, donors, giving charities, they don't know where the money is going actually. We have 7 million madrasa students and 300,000 mosques. All of us give, even I give money to them. I don't know where the money is going. So people have to be motivated and told in a massive scale that give the money and ensure where it is going. That point, sir, we must keep in mind. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you for raising this. And I think the state of Bangladesh has been doing a lot of good stuff, kind of trying to cooperate with the countries in the region, including with India. There is this need, and I think when in banking, the most important thing is the banks that these charities or these trusts bank with are very important, and that's why we have know your customer standards. Before you take an account, any account, corporate account, or individual account, you should be very careful and do a due diligence as to whom that account is, who's even the beneficial owner of that account. About your question about donors, I agree a lot of the small donors give funds out of religious obligation, purely religious, no political purpose, no terrorism. But the big donors are the ones who really vitiate the whole giving spree. And I think, then again, it comes to the banks, really. A lot of stuff the banks have to do with the collaboration of the intelligence agency and the law enforcement agencies. Whether in Bangladesh or in India or elsewhere, especially in the US, the banks are blamed and guillotined time in, time out. The important thing is it can't be a one-way flow of information, only from the bank to the law enforcement authorities. It has to be both ways. Banks need some guidance. Who are the bad guys? Whom should we ostracize from the system? Whom should be quarantined from the system? Who to avoid? That guidance is in many ways lacking. Wouldn't want to go into the details given the constraints of time, but it suffices to say that the banks and the law enforcement agencies, that's important. And as I mentioned earlier, the Muslim communities, who are most of them, 99.999% of them, are innocent givers, need to condemn the fringe radical elements across board, India, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, US, wherever else. Thanks.
Let me ask this. Is there any evidence here of state support of terrorism to the particular organizations that you're talking about? Are there particular states in the region that we know are laundering the money, but that the ultimate source is the state itself?
Very good question, but very difficult to answer as well, because Marvin asks the best questions. State funding, to the extent Gulf donors, some states have had this official policy that we'll be getting rid of all the Shias, and we want to obliterate all Shias, for example, so on and so forth. That's what we hear in news reports. Is that their official policy? Maybe not. But the rich donors from within their states, some of whom may be politically connected, like the Al-Rajis, for example, mentioned in the case of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, They are really difficult to monitor for obvious reasons because they have political connections. So I would say the state per se does, unless there is an actual state sponsor of terrorism policy per se, but the state may be looking the other way and allowing this laundering activity through its banks and financial institutions. And the laundering activity doesn't only take place in South Asia or the Middle East. It goes all the way to London and to European markets as well.
Michael Hudson from Georgetown University. I wanted to follow up on the first question that was asked because I think it's a very important one, and it has to do with numbers. We all know from our studies of international relations that the ingredients of power are not just numbers of soldiers on the ground and numbers of tanks, but also other kinds of financial and material resources. And I wondered if you can be a little bit more specific about the numbers involved here. You said that it could be millions of dollars, it could be billions, but can we be a little more precise and try to identify over a particular period of time what order of magnitude are we talking about? And secondly, can you say anything about the trend in funding? For example, I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here that ISIS is on a roll and maybe more money is coming in. And if we knew that they're getting more money this month than they got last month and so on, that would certainly be a kind of a force multiplier for them, and it might explain things like why some of the Taliban leadership has just shifted its alliance to ISIS from Mullah Omar. And I'm wondering if you have an idea of whether, you know, ISIS is sort of carrying the day here, and and what that would mean.
Great question, Michael. I would say that in terms of the numbers, terrorist financing is very hard to identify and trace, A, and B, there are very few terrorist financing laws across jurisdictions that adequately criminalize terrorist financing. So what money is actually in which stage of the terrorist financing cycle, which is raising money, storing money, moving money, and using it for terrorist attacks? That's one problem. The other is the fact that terrorist financing, as I mentioned earlier, entails so much more in terms of indoctrination, radicalization, recruitment, training, media management, and the actual perpetration of terrorist attacks. Bin Laden, for example, before 9/11 was drawing something like $30 million a year. So those were kind of hard numbers. Talking more recently about ISIS, few million dollars a day from oil, which is a spigot that's still open. Nothing really has been done given the vicarious interests of different parties involved, commercially more so, and some politically as well. In terms of how much funds it has, different accounts from a few hundred million to a few billion. But the fact with ISIS is they are extorting money from their constituents as well. It's like the government who does the tax and spend frenzy. You know? So those are the approximate numbers. But it's always hard to identify and trace which assets are involved in terrorist financing, which are not. So therefore, it becomes difficult to quantify to exact numbers.
I have a question here from the overflow room from Dylan Clement, IRI, International Republican Institute. There's much mention of ISIS attracting money from the Gulf, and at the same time, there's a perception that ISIS is self-sufficient. How do you reconcile this?
Okay. My sense is that it's not self-sufficient as if it's drawing funds only from itself. Because if you look at the oil smuggling across the board from the Syrian border and the Iraqi border to Turkey, there are Turkish elements and others who are involved. So you can't really say that they're self-funding. So I think it's a fallacy to even label it or delineate it as self-funding. It's drawing taxes from, it's extorting, it engages in kidnapping for ransom. That's one. And the fact that I mentioned earlier, initially there may be some state sponsorship also, either directly or through rich donors, or through individuals I mentioned earlier, where the state is turning the other eye. It's either letting these things happen, A, or B, it doesn't really know what's happening, which is difficult to really accept given the fact that these rich donors have connections with states, state operatives or state personnel.
Well, let me, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Jared Feldschreiber, Russian News, RIA Novosti. Can you explain how maybe the FBI and the FSB have helped to thwart some of the jihadism, maybe in the Caucasus or in throughout the Middle East?
Well, I think the FBI has been working with a lot of international law enforcement agencies, essentially through intelligence sharing. And they aren't open instances, open reporting of joint operations per se, but yes, in terms of intelligence sharing. But if we see what happened to one of the Boston brothers, the Russians gave information to the Bureau, and the Bureau really slept over it, as it were, for various reasons. I mean, the same thing happened with the Phoenix memo as far as the FBI is concerned pre 9/11. So there are certain gaps there. But yes, in terms of intelligence sharing, the FBI, not only of the Russians, but across the board, is pretty actively engaged in a robust effort, including averting a lot of the attacks here that have not occurred, thanks to the watchful eyes of the Bureau and its state and local partners. I mean, when you talk about the FBI, you can't do it in isolation. FBI heads the Joint Terrorism Task Force in a number of jurisdictions. So it's the combined effort of the FBI, and I'm a strict votary of federalism, So I believe in more empowerment of the state and the locals also. So I think the Joint Terrorism Task Force has been successful, and the FBI has been collaborating essentially through intelligence sharing two-way with the Russians, the Indians, and the Pakistanis, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Fatima Anani. I'm from Georgetown University. So following Dr. Marvin's question regarding states funding terrorist organizations, and with the specific regards to ISIS, how would you explain that some certain states who have strong relations with the US and the UK still support or fund like the ISIS, given that they have threatened those countries?
Well, different states have different national interests, and they have different motivations, and they have different constituents. So they may have friendly relations with the US, but they have their own domestic compulsions, not to justify what they do, either overtly or covertly, but they have their own interests, and many a time their own interests clash with the US. That's why one of the steps I suggested was more aggressive outreach, both in, which the Treasury is doing and the Department of State is doing. And I think when you say outreach, it could extend to even overreaching or arm twisting at times. Because for us, our national interest is keeping the US secure and our allies secure also. So it has to be explained to the states where such funding originates from, that in the long run, or even the medium run, it's in their interest. For example, the Saudis have really realized that, and the Kuwaitis have realized that, and the Qataris have realized that. But again, I always believe just cobbling, and the Turks also did that, just cobbling together a hastily framed terrorist financing law, if it's not implemented adequately, doesn't really make sense. I mean, I'm always looking for hard figures, as Michael mentioned. What are the seizures? What are the arrests? What has been seized? How many arrests are there? What are the prosecutions? What are the convictions? What impact does a certain countering the financing of terrorism measure or counterterrorism measure have in stamping out or in curbing terrorist financing? So that's what I'm looking at. So just having a law and appeasing the U.S. Should not play and will not play henceforth, I think. Thanks.
I'm not seeing another. Well, let me ask one, since we have just a couple of minutes left. Since most of the terrorist organizations don't go on the market to buy planes or tanks or heavy artillery. Therefore, we could argue that their ability to carry out the kind of guerrilla operations that most of them do doesn't require very much money. That they can live off the land, if you will. They can tap on the grievances that people have and that are willing to keep the insurgency or the whatever the actions may be going, even in the absence of large sums of funds. So, would you agree then that we really have not necessarily gotten, we may be able to stymie groups such as we now face with ISIS in Iraq, but that this is only a very small part, however important it is, of the counterterrorism that we're going to need to really get the upper hand on most terrorist groups?
Great question, as always, Marvin. Thanks. Countering financing of terrorism is not the only strategy, as Marvin said. There is the diplomatic strategy, there is the outreach strategy, and other elements of intelligence sharing and law enforcement, which in tandem with, because no strategy is exclusive, it would be this strategy or that strategy. It is a potpourri of a number of strategies depending on the terrorist group in the country. About the arms, I would say a lot of them have been left by us, especially in Afghanistan, which have been exploited by the Taliban and other criminal gangs. Similarly, in Iraq, ISIS has captured a lot of what we had left behind with the Iraqis. They have pillaged Iraqi banks. They have plundered the depots of arms and ammunition that we had left behind for the Iraqis for their security. So, and very many times, terrorist groups do not need huge armies. ISIS is more like an outlier in that case. They can do with small arms and ammunition. Anything that causes mass hysteria and fear and dread among the population that they govern or they coerce, I would add, is sufficient to keep the rebellion within their population at bay.
Well, I think what we've certainly learned today is, if we didn't know already, is how murky a subject this is, how difficult it is to get a handle on what's out there, and yet, despite my perhaps saying that it doesn't take much in the way of money, indeed, financing is going to be very critical to our gaining the upper hand. And I want to thank Dr. Amit Kumar, who I didn't properly introduce at the beginning, and I was remiss in that. If you note on on the flyers that you have his very extensive background here, you'll see that he was eminently qualified to discuss this topic today, and we want to thank him for throwing light on, again, a very murky topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you, everyone, including the people watching from afar, to spend this hour with me. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Kate, as well.